Two girls named Gwendolyn and Lucy wait outside the house of a man named James Pimplebottom, who they have seen die in the future. As he comes out of his house with his dogs, Gwendolyn goes to meet him to introduce herself and also inform him that she's from the future. James looks shocked by this, but Gwendolyn says she's there to save him from the pox that will kill him in the future. James thinks she's just messing with him, but as Gwendolyn brings out a syringe containing a pox vaccine, he realizes that she's serious. Before she can inject him with the vaccine, he runs away because he still doesn't know who she is. Gwendolyn also runs after him, and after a while, Lucy stands in front of James to stop him from going anywhere. As she then distracts him, Gwendolyn injects him, and he falls to the ground. Gwendolyn and Lucy are happy about this, and they praise each other for saving yet another life. Almost immediately, James stands up and runs away. And Gwendolyn and Lucy also decide to return to the future. Later that night, while Gwendolyn is sleeping, she keeps dreaming about her ex-boyfriend, Gideon. She eventually wakes up because she can't sleep well, and as she complains to her gargoyle, he tells her to think about something else and return to sleep. Elsewhere, Gideon reads a book that reminds him of Gwendolyn, and his brother, Raphael, tells him to call her since he still likes her. Following this, Gideon calls Gwendolyn, but as she sees his call, her gargoyle tells her not to forget that she doesn't want to speak to him because he broke her heart. Gwendolyn then ignores his call, but Gideon eventually sends a text. In the text, Gideon tells Gwendolyn to call him so they can talk about something urgent. He adds that someone named Paul gave him the memoir of a secret society called the Order of Count Saint-Germain.
Es könnte sie in Gefahr bringen.
And that even though he doesn't understand the content yet, he believes she has to be careful. He ends the text by telling her to try to get in touch with him, but as she thinks about it, her gargoyle advises her against it. Elsewhere, a man named Mr. Whitman declares himself as the new Grandmaster of the Order. Some members of the secret society don't like this, but they eventually confirm that the Count put Whitman in charge. Following this, Whitman encourages his colleagues to ensure they don't take any more risks in completing any of their activities. The next day at school, Gwendolyn's best friend, Leslie, notices that she didn't sleep well because she couldn't stop thinking about Gideon. As Gwendolyn then talks about how it feels like Gideon has cut off a part of her heart, another student comes over to meet the girls to invite them to a costume party. Gwendolyn and Leslie don't really seem interested in attending the party, but as the organizer encourages them to select a good costume, Gwendolyn's cousin, Charlotte, walks toward them and says what she'll be wearing. Gwendolyn doesn't look happy to see her, and as Charlotte walks away,
Party ist es bestimmt grün.
she tells Leslie that her cousin is like a poisonous snake. Shortly after, they walk toward their class and see Charlotte talking to Whitman, who happens to be a teacher at the school. Leslie initially wonders what Charlotte sees in Whitman, but she ends up insulting him, and this makes Gwendolyn smile. After school that day, Gwendolyn heads outside only to see Gideon talking to Charlotte. She looks disappointed by this and decides to walk past them without saying a word. As Gideon then tries to talk to her, Gwendolyn just ignores him and walks away. On her way home, two guards from the Order grab Gwendolyn on the road and inform her that she needs to follow them. Gwendolyn says she's tired of being treated like a slave by the Order, but before she knows what's happening, she suddenly disappears and finds herself in the year 1601.
Wir müssen uns bereit machen.
Gwendolyn is shocked by this, but as she sees Shakespeare, she disappears again. This time, she returns to her real world and sees Gideon holding her. As she looks confused, Gideon says she has to come with him to the Order to jump through time. He also tells her to forget everything that happened between them because he has recently discovered things that mean they have to work together. Gwendolyn still doesn't look happy seeing him, but he tells her that they need to head to the Order before the members become suspicious that she hasn't jumped through time in a while. Gwendolyn thinks about this for a while and decides to follow Gideon to the Order. When they get there, Whitman sounds pissed that Gwendolyn hasn't traveled through time in a while because she was annoyed at Gideon. As he scolds her and accuses her of being in possession of a chronograph belonging to a couple named Paul and Lucy, Gwendolyn denies this and says she would have given up the time travel device if she had it. Gideon also defends her and mentions that she has promised not to cause any more trouble. Even though though Gwendolyn didn't promise him anything, she tells Whitman that she'll start traveling through time in the right way by using the Order's chronograph.
Jetzt keinen Ärger mehr zu machen.
Following this, Whitman tells Gwendolyn to use the chronograph in his office to jump through time, and Gideon says he'll follow her. Just then, Gwendolyn puts her hand in the chronograph, and it takes her blood sample before sending her to the year 1955. After a while, Gideon joins her and says sorry for breaking her heart. Gwendolyn feels inclined to accept his apology, but when he says he wants them to just be friends, she sounds quite pissed and believes that he doesn't like her. Gideon then says he does, but that he wants them to be friends so they can trust each other. A while later, Gwendolyn returns home and meets her aunt, Maddie, talking to a butler named Mr. Bernard. As Maddie sees her, she shows Gwendolyn a treasure she kept for her. It turns out that Gwendolyn's chronograph is inside the box, and Maddie mentions that no one has come snooping around for it. Following this, Gwendolyn carries the box away, but Charlotte sees her with it and wonders what she's hiding.
Madam?
Gwendolyn says she kept a vase inside the box, but Charlotte doesn't believe her. She then tries to make Gwendolyn jealous by saying that she's going to the upcoming costume party with Gideon. Gwendolyn says she doesn't care, but she gets Charlotte pissed when she says that she has already traveled through time with Gideon that day. Just then, Gwendolyn enters her room and hides the box in her locker. Shortly after, some men from the Order show up at the house, and even though Bernard refuses to let them in, Charlotte shows up and tells the butler to let them do their jobs because Gwendolyn has something that doesn't belong to her. The men then head to Gwendolyn's room to look for the box containing the chronograph. Gwendolyn looks shocked to see them, but she's unable to do anything as they start scattering her room. While they're at it, Maddie enters the room and sees the men looking for the box.
Wo ist der Schlüssel?
As she realizes that Charlotte is responsible for calling them, Maddie scolds her and asks why she did something like that to her cousin. Charlotte then says she doesn't want Gwendolyn to sabotage something she doesn't understand. Almost immediately, the men find the box, but they see that it's locked. As one of them asks for the key, Gwendolyn says she has already misplaced it. Gwendolyn still doesn't like the fact that they're taking her box away, but Charlotte says she brought it upon herself and that she has no respect for the mysteries she's linked to. Elsewhere, Gideon arrives home and sees that his apartment has been scattered. He also sees Raphael on the floor and immediately runs to help him. Raphael then mentions that some men from the Order broke into their apartment. Gideon looks shocked and immediately checks the place he hid the memoir, but he doesn't find it there. Before he starts panicking, Raphael shows him the book and says he had to keep it hidden when the men arrived. Gideon looks relieved as he sees it because he could have gotten into trouble if they found the book.
Salami?
Meanwhile, Charlotte follows the Order's guards to meet Whitman so he can check the box. As he opens it though, he sees that it contains toys, and he scolds Charlotte for wasting his time. Charlotte says she knows that Gwendolyn has the second chronograph, but Whitman finds it hard to believe her. He also mentions that she's probably just trying to remain relevant now that she's no longer the center of attraction. Charlotte looks sad as she hears this, and Whitman keeps insulting her. Interestingly, it turns out that Bernard already kept the chronograph for Gwendolyn, and as he returns it to her, she thanks him. Later that night, as Gideon and Raphael prepare to leave the house for the costume party, Charlotte comes over to meet them. Charlotte finds it surprising that the apartment is scattered, but as she asks what happened, Gideon tells her to stop pretending like she doesn't know. He also scolds her for allowing Whitman and the Order to use her, even though they're up to no good.
Tu nicht so unschuldig.
As he insults her for betraying her cousin, Charlotte tries to defend herself, but Gideon doesn't seem to care about what she has to say. After a while, Gwendolyn and Leslie arrive at the party, only to see Charlotte getting drunk as she talks about Gideon. Leslie looks confused as to why Charlotte is partying hard, and she also notices that Gideon is not around. Gwendolyn doesn't seem to care about this, but she finds it funny that Charlotte is drunk. Shortly after, Gwendolyn sees Charlotte singing singing and dancing at the party. She then goes to meet Charlotte to tell her to control herself. Charlotte says she just wants to have fun because her sacrifices for the Order don't seem to mean anything again. As she says that no one likes her, she continues singing and dancing, and Gwendolyn just leaves her alone. Elsewhere, Gideon sneaks into Whitman's office and uses the chronograph to travel through time.
Und dann gibt's danach so einen.
After he leaves, two of the Order's guards enter the office and realize that he has jumped through time without permission. Meanwhile, Gideon lands in the year 1786 and goes to confront the first Grandmaster of the Order, Count Saint-Germain, to ask if his endgame is to really kill Gwendolyn so he can live forever and set up his world order. The Count doesn't deny this, and he says that Gwendolyn will still dedicate her life to him. Gideon says he won't let that happen, but the Count mentions that he has an advantage because he knows Gwendolyn's weakness. He then says that Gwendolyn's love for Gideon will bring her to him. Before Gideon can stab him, the Count's loyal guard, Miro, appears behind him with a gun. Gideon is shocked by this, and the Count tells Miro to take him to the dungeon.
Zu jeder Zeit.
Shortly after, Gwendolyn and Leslie leave the party and head to a restaurant where they talk about how the Order wants to close a blood circle so that the Count will return to power. Gwendolyn wonders if it has already happened in the past because that's where the Count is, but Leslie mentions that the blood circle can only be closed in their current time. Elsewhere, Gideon gets beaten up badly before he's locked in a cell. Much later, Charlotte leaves the party and sees two of the Order's guards breaking into her house. Gwendolyn's gargoyle quickly wakes her up to find a place to hide, but the men stop her before she can go anywhere. As they then drag her out of her room, Charlotte shows up and beats them up while telling them to leave her cousin alone. Gwendolyn is shocked by this, and the guards also can't believe that she's fighting them. After the guards pass out, Bernard shows up and tells Gwendolyn that he needs to take her to a safe place. Almost immediately, she packs her things, and Charlotte gives her an emergency suitcase that contains everything she might need. Gwendolyn thanks her for this, but she asks what Charlotte will do next. Charlotte says she'll probably lie to the Order about what happened, and that Gwendolyn just needs to leave for her own safety.
Miss Gwendolyn?
Following this, Gwendolyn heads outside, and Bernard drives her out of the city in an exotic car. Elsewhere, Whitman sees Gideon inside the cell at the Order's headquarters. He then places a letter on Gideon's body so he can deliver it to the Count by using the chronograph to return to 1786. After delivering the letter, Gideon begs the Count to leave Gwendolyn alone, but he says he really wants to know if she would rather protect the chronograph or save her ex-boyfriend. Meanwhile, Raphael calls Charlotte to ask if she has seen Gideon. Charlotte says she hasn't, and Raphael starts wondering if he has been abducted. Elsewhere, Bernard takes Gwendolyn to her parents' old cottage, which also happens to be where Lucy and Paul used to live many years ago. It then turns out that Lucy and Paul are actually Gwendolyn's parents.
Moment mal, dann
Shortly after, Gwendolyn enters the house and calls Charlotte, who tells her that Gideon is missing. Gwendolyn is shocked by this, and as Charlotte asks if she knows where he is, she says she doesn't know. After the call ends, Gwendolyn tells Bernard that they need to head back home because Gideon is missing, but he says it's not a good idea. He then says she'll have to go back in time to speak to Lucy and Paul because they might know what to do to save Gideon if he has been abducted. Following this, Gwendolyn travels to 1967 and finds herself still inside the old cottage. As Lucy and Paul see her, they look shocked and nearly attack her, but she quickly introduces herself. Her parents then ask what's happening in her current time, and Gwendolyn mentions that the world is sliding into chaos and that the Order is somehow involved. She adds that Gideon is missing and has likely been abducted, and that she's scared they'll get to her soon. Lucy then mentions that the Count is controlling everything because he wants to establish an elitist rule that neglects the needs of the wider population.
Paul ist halt alt.
Gwendolyn can't seem to understand how he's able to do that, even though he has been dead for 200 years. But Lucy says that the Count possesses more power than they can imagine. Paul then mentions that Gwendolyn is the only one who can stop him. Gwendolyn doesn't think she can do this, but Paul says he'll train her. As he stands up, though, he struggles to maintain balance, and Lucy tells him not to hurt himself. Following this, he tells Gwendolyn to meet a younger version of him so he can train her. The next day, Charlotte goes to apologize to Whitman for beating up the guards who wanted to abduct Gwendolyn. She says she thought they were burglars, and that she knows she made a mistake. Whitman believes her apology is sincere, but he says that she'll have to prove her loyalty again. Charlotte agrees to do whatever she's told to do, and Whitman sends her to the dungeon to give Gideon some food. As she sees him,
Bist du zufrieden?
Charlotte feels sorry for him and distracts the guard near the cell so she can tell Gideon that Gwendolyn is safe. Gideon looks confused because he thought Charlotte was working for Whitman, but she tells him to be patient because she'll soon find a way to free him. The next day, Gwendolyn goes to the year 1920 to train with a younger Paul. After their training, Gwendolyn heads home and gets a video message from Gideon, who has been forced to convince her to bring the chronograph to the Count. Gideon tries to warn Gwendolyn not to do it, but Whitman hurts him and appears in the video. He then tells Gwendolyn to follow his instructions if she still wants to see Gideon. After the video ends, Gwendolyn looks sad and tells Bernard that the Order wants her to deliver the chronograph to the Pimple house in 1786 on a special night called the Bonfire Night. The next day, Gwendolyn argues with her gargoyle on whether Gideon is worth saving. Shortly after, Charlotte shows up at the scene, and they look happy to see each other.
Die perfekte Nacht für ein Verbrechen.
The ladies then talk about what to do about Gideon, and Charlotte says they need to protect the chronograph because if the Count gets it, he'll destroy the world. As they joke about how Gideon will have to rot in the dungeon, Charlotte says she can find a way to give him the key to his cell. Gwendolyn then says she's not sure she can take down the Count alone, but Charlotte says that Gideon can help her. As Gwendolyn looks confused, Charlotte tells her to write a letter to Gideon about their plan so that he'll be more convinced when he sees her handwriting. Following this, Gwendolyn writes the letter, and Charlotte finds a way to get it to Gideon through his food. As Gideon is about to eat his food, he sees Gwendolyn's note and a key. He then reads the note and learns that Gwendolyn wants him to use the key to free himself so they can meet at the Pimple house on Bonfire Night to take down the Count. Elsewhere, Gwendolyn and Bernard return to the city with the chronograph. Gwendolyn then changes her clothes and takes the chronograph to the Order. Whitman says it's good to see that she has come back to her senses, and Gwendolyn sarcastically replies that she's doing the right thing. Whitman seems impressed by this, but as he stands up, his face changes into that of the Count, and this leaves Gwendolyn shocked. After the Count laughs for a while, Whitman's face returns to normal, and he leads the other members of the Order to hail their leader. Elsewhere, the Count goes to meet Gideon to take a sample of his blood. Gideon happens to be one of the time travelers whose blood is needed to close the blood circle and restore the Count back to his leadership position. After the Count takes his blood sample, Gideon says he's sure Gwendolyn won't do what he wants. The Count then laughs as he says she will. Elsewhere, Whitman uses the Order's chronograph to send Gwendolyn to the year 1786.
Hamlet.
To meet the Count on Bonfire Night. When she gets there, she sees Miro, who welcomes her to the Count's castle and takes her chronograph from her. As he then says that his master will be with her soon, she manipulates him into telling her that the Count's real plan is to become immortal by closing the blood circle. Meanwhile, Gideon lures a guard into his cell so he can beat him up and escape. When he gets outside, he sees people celebrating the Bonfire Night and takes one of their masks. After a while, the Count arrives at his castle with Gideon's blood. Gwendolyn tries to stop him from touching her chronograph, but he tells her that Gideon won't be coming to save her. He adds that she and Gideon have completed their part in his mission. Gwendolyn realizes that the Count only wanted her to come to 1786 to drop the chronograph, and she stands in his way to stop him from getting close to it. The Count just pushes her away, but before he adds Gideon's blood to the chronograph, she knocks off the vial from his hand, and he gets pissed.
Was haben Sie mit ihr gemacht?
Miro also tries to attack her, but before he can do anything, Gideon enters the room and helps Gwendolyn fight the men. Gwendolyn then takes the chronograph and leaves the room with Gideon, while the Count sounds pissed and tells Miro not to let them leave. When they get outside, Gideon confesses his love to Gwendolyn, and she says she feels the same way. As they see Miro and some guards headed toward them, Gwendolyn suggests talking about their love for each other later. Gideon then says he can't be close to the chronograph because his blood is the last one left to close the blood circle. Following this, they head separate ways, and Gwendolyn hides the chronograph near the woods. Unfortunately, Gideon gets shot as he runs away, and Gwendolyn quickly runs toward him. Gideon tells her to leave, but she says she can't do that, and Miro captures them. The Count also arrives and finds where the chronograph was hidden. He then gets his men to hold Gwendolyn while he cuts Gideon's hand. After he does this,
Hör auf, ich lass dich doch jetzt nicht alleine, kannst du vergessen.
he drops Gideon's blood into the chronograph, and it releases a green potion at the top. As Gwendolyn tries to stop him from drinking the potion, Miro shoots her. Gideon is shocked by this, and as he complains about it, Miro also kills him. Just then, the Count drinks the potion and transforms into a younger version of himself, who happens to look just like Whitman. Meanwhile, Gideon and Gwendolyn's bodies return to the front of their school, and Charlotte, Bernard, and Raphael quickly run to check up on them. Unfortunately, they discover that they are both dead, and this makes them sad. However, Gwendolyn suddenly wakes up, and as they all look shocked, Bernard says they must take her to a safe place. Shortly after, Gwendolyn is taken to the cottage with Charlotte and Raphael. Gideon still happens to be dead, and Bernard says he has already made arrangements for his funeral.
Weil
Raphael then asks why Gwendolyn is still alive while Gideon died. Charlotte tells him not to blame anyone for Gideon's death, but Gwendolyn says that Gideon didn't deserve to die, as she also mentions that she's not supposed to be alive because she got hit by the bullet. Her gargoyle shows up and tells her that it seems she's immortal. Gwendolyn and the others are shocked by this, but the gargoyle mentions that the way her wound got healed is not normal, and it only happens like that for immortals. Gwendolyn cannot believe this, but she says she'll need to confirm it. As she picks up a knife, she tells Charlotte to stab her so they can see if she's really immortal. Charlotte doesn't like this, but Gwendolyn tells her to do it for Gideon. Following this, Charlotte stabs Gwendolyn, and she falls to the ground. Surprisingly, her wound heals quite fast, and everyone realizes that Gwendolyn is indeed immortal. A while later, Gwendolyn and the others bury Gideon not too far from the cottage. After the funeral, Gwendolyn keeps thinking about Gideon's death and decides to fall off a cliff. Charlotte tries to stop her, but before she gets to the cliff, Gwendolyn jumps through time and disappears. Interestingly, Gwendolyn finds herself in Paul and Lucy's cottage again. She also sees Lucy outside and asks what year they're currently in. Lucy says she's in 1920, and she calls Paul to come to see who came to visit them. After they enter the house, Gwendolyn tells them about everything that happened, and Paul says it's quite strange that the Count did a lot of evil things just to get something Gwendolyn was born with. Gwendolyn then says she would give up her immortality if it changes the past. Almost immediately, Lucy gets an idea and suggests altering the past to prevent Gideon's death. Lucy says it should be possible because they stopped James from dying in the past. Paul is not so sure about this, and Gwendolyn says she can't go back in time because she no longer has her chronograph.
Gideon hat was vorgelesen, hier aus den Memoiren des Grafen.
Lucy sounds shocked and asks how she got to 1920, and Gwendolyn says she doesn't know. Lucy then realizes that Gwendolyn can accurately move through time without using the chronograph. She also mentions that Gwendolyn just has to focus her feelings and mind to be able to make the jump. As they sit together to try it again, Gwendolyn suddenly creates a strange energy source that takes her back to the future. Charlotte and Raphael look shocked to see her, but she says she needs to return to 1920 because it seems Lucy's plan to bring back Gideon from the dead is possible. Charlotte and Raphael don't understand what she's talking about, but she just leaves them alone and returns to 1920. After learning how to use her powers better, Lucy encourages Gwendolyn to try to go back in time to save Gideon.
Du tust es jetzt nur für ihn.
Following this, Gwendolyn jumps through time and returns to the Pimple Bottom house in 1786. Interestingly, the garden around the house looks like a maze, and as she wonders how she'll get out, she sees James and his wife sitting by the fountain. As she approaches him to help her, James thinks she's an intruder, but she introduces herself as the person who saved him from the pox years ago. James remembers this and also realizes that he was the only one who survived the pox in his family. James then thanks her for saving his life and shows her where to go. Unfortunately, Gwendolyn gets to the woods after Miro had already killed Gideon and her doppelganger before the Count drinks the potion. Gwendolyn attacks his guards and heads toward him. She eventually knocks the potion off his hand and overpowers Miro. As she's about to grab the potion though, Miro nearly kills her, but James shows up to protect her. She looks shocked by this, but he mentions that he's grateful to her for saving his life. Just then, she points her gun at the Count, but he says she doesn't have the guts to pull the trigger. Gwendolyn says she's not the girl he used to know, and she shoots the chronograph to destroy it. The Count gets killed in the process.
Dafür bist du nicht stark genug.
And Whitman's body also turns to ashes because he's the Count's younger self. After this, Gwendolyn picks up the potion and pours it on Gideon's chest wound. Luckily, Gideon wakes up and they both look happy to see each other again. As they then get teleported back to their normal time, Charlotte, Raphael, and Bernard welcome them back happily. The next day, Gwendolyn heads to her school and sees that it's now named after James Pimplebottom. As she enters the school, Leslie and Charlotte welcome her in and show her that the new janitor is her uncle, William. Much later, Gwendolyn and Gideon return to 1925 to attend a party. Gwendolyn then brings out the green potion and pours it into her drink. Gideon asks what it is, and Gwendolyn says it's a neutralization potion that makes immortals turn to mortals. Gideon asks if she really wants to give up her immortality, and she says she does because she wants to grow old with him. Gideon smiles as he hears this, and after she drinks the potion, they leave their seats to dance. Even though Gwendolyn didn't initially think she could take down the Count on her own, she ended up playing an important role in stopping the evil man from destroying the world. She also went back in time to save Gideon and chose to give up her immortality so she could grow old with him. Gwendolyn's journey shows that even when we doubt ourselves, courage and determination can lead us to accomplish more things than we could ever imagine.